Video 5, and it's the companion to video 4 and the graphing assignment. I'm in our shared folder inside the graphing assignment folder, and you've got two files here. NBA attendance and ticket prices is the actual graphing assignment, but the one I want for this video is period 2 quiz scores, which I'm just going to use as a sample. So you don't have to actually do anything with this file unless you want it for extra practice. You could just use it to follow along with what I'm doing here. And I could open it with Google Sheets, but it's actually really hard to do some of these graphs in Google Sheets because that doesn't have as many graphing capabilities. So instead I'm going to download this. I'm looking for this icon right here, and then it's going to download it into my bottom taskbar, bottom left. So let me open that up in Excel. And what you're looking at is the quiz scores for my second period 9th grade honors biology class this past semester. I picked 25 students to show, and I redacted their last names. And when you're a teacher and you're looking at your students' quiz scores, you want to ask yourself, how did my kids do on the quiz? Are they doing better? Are they doing worse over time? Am I teaching it well? Should I do things differently? Things like that. So I have 5 questions. First of all, what part of the class got an A on quiz 1, and what part of the class got B's, C's, D's, and F's? How did the students do on quiz 1? So what's the general spread or distribution of the scores for that quiz? For number 3, I've got some struggling students in the class. How did they do on quiz 1? And how did they do on quiz 2? And how do their scores compare with the rest of the class? Is there a relationship between how well students do on quiz 1 and how well they do on quiz 2? And for my struggling students, did their scores improve over the course of the semester in my class or not? So let's answer quiz or question 1 first, and I'm just going to select that and I'm going to copy it. I can copy it by either right-clicking and hitting copy, or I could, since I'm on a Mac, I could do Command C, and if you're on a PC, you could also do Control C, or you could go to Edit, like the Edit button up here at the top, and I could copy it there. So I'm going to paste it into cell A29, and I'm just going to right-click and paste, or I could hit Command V. And by the way, one thing I should say before I move on is I am on a Mac computer, and that means that the command keys that I'm using, as well as the layout of the tools and the toolbars themselves in Excel might be different on yours. So about my program, I'm using Microsoft Excel for Mac 2011. If you're using a different version, you might have some different layouts or functions, and if you're using a PC, then some things are going to be very, very different in Excel for PC. So if that's the case and you really want to do your graphs in Excel, I would highly recommend that you watch the Gelier Academy videos, which are in those blue video suggestions that I put in the NBA file, because that guy used a PC to do all of his graphs. Okay, so the question is, what part of the class got an A on quiz 1, which means that I need my quiz 1 scores. So these, let me highlight them and Command C, and then I'm going to paste them by basically just selecting a bunch of cells in here, and I'm going to hit Command V, and that pastes them in there for me. Now, one thing I don't like is there are these weird breaks in my file that basically start hiding my data, and that's really annoying. So I'm going to go up to, is it Window? And then I'm going to unfreeze these panes, and that gets rid of them for me. Okay, so now I don't have that issue anymore. So let's scroll down. Okay, here we are. Let's start with my bins. And I'm also going to need my bin labels. And I'm going to need my grade categories. And I'm going to need my frequency. So what's the frequency of each of these grades in this class. One thing that's really annoying is when I type in grade categories, but then because it's running off this little cell, the rest of it kind of disappears. So I can fix that by going to wrap text, and then now it just fits it all in that one cell so that I don't have to worry about that anymore. Okay, so for my bins, I know what my grade categories are. That's an A, a B, a C, a D, and an F. Since this quiz is out of 20 points max, that means that an A should be 90% of that, or 18 to 20 points. So my bin is going to be 18 to 20 for an A. Now, how I'm going to label that for my Excel function is I'm going to just put in the upper limit, because you can't get higher than a 20 on this quiz, and if you get 100% of the points, that's an A. For my next bin, 80% of 20 points is 16, and that should be 16 to 17.9, and my bin label is going to be a 17.9. So here's what this means. It means that if you get higher than a 17.9, you no longer have a B. At this point, you now have an A. So 17.9 is the upper limit for this bin. And then my next bin will be 14 to 15.9, and my next one will be 12 to 13.9, and then my last one is going to be 0 to 11.9. Okay? Upper limit for this bin is 15.9. Upper limit for the next bin is 13.9, and upper limit for the next bin is 11.9. Now for the frequency, I actually want Excel to calculate that for me, and what it's going to do is it's going to create what's called a data array. And hopefully you remember that word from Algebra 2. But in order to tell Excel that we're going to be creating this array, I'm going to select all of these cells that I want my array or the function to be applied to. So once I've selected all of them, now I can hit the equal sign. And when you do that, notice that it appears in the cell, and it also appears in the function bar at the very top. So anything that I write in here will also appear in that function bar, and f of x, right, function of x. So by hitting the equal sign, what I'm doing is I'm telling Excel, I'm not just typing in text, I'm actually going to have you, Excel, do some math for me. So equals frequency. And then because I type in this word a lot into Excel, it auto-suggests it for me. So for you, you would just type in the word frequency, and then you would put in your parentheses after that. And once you put in the parentheses, it will tell you what needs to go, like this little bar pops up that tells you what needs to go inside the parentheses. So two things. There needs to be a data array, and there needs to be a bins. Then you can just click on that word and it should pop up what that actually means. Okay, well, maybe not. Forget that. But anyways, the data array essentially means the data. And that's all of this stuff. Now notice that as I click and drag to select, it also autofills those cells for me into this function. So this is saying that my data array is going to be everything between cells A32 and A56. And that colon in there means that we're including all data values in between those two cells. So here's cell A32, 17.5. And here's cell A56, 15, and everything in between. So that's my data array. Now the other thing that needs to go into this function is the bins array. So I need to separate my data array from my bins array with a comma. So comma. And then my bin array, I'm not going to use these bins because that dash essentially means minus, and 18 minus 20 is -2, and that's not what I want here. I just want this stuff. So the bin labels, and select that. Remember, bin labels are the upper limits of your bins only. So the upper limit of each bin would be the bin label that would be part of your bins array. So anytime that you have an open parenthesis, make sure you also have a closed parenthesis on the other end, and you're done with this function. In order to apply it to all of the cells, instead of just hitting enter, you actually need to hit Control Shift Enter, or if you're on a Mac keyboard, Control-Shift-Return, and it will apply it to all of them. And let's just double check that Excel did what we wanted it to do. So Excel is saying that I have 2 F's in my data set. Well, an F is anything that's between 0 and 11.9. So let's just make sure I do have 2 F's in here. So just kind of like scroll down. That's not enough, that's not enough, that's not... Hey, there's an F, 11.5. And there's another F, 9.5. And are there any more? No. Okay, so I found 2 F's, and that's what Excel told me I would find, so I think we're good. All right, so now let's actually figure out what part of the class got an A in terms of percentages. So I'm going to select these two, my grade categories, and the frequency of scores for each category. And then I'm going to go to Charts, which for me is in this top toolbar. And I'm going to select this type of chart. And there we go. But it could be better because this is not really, like I can mouse over the pie segments and it will tell you that 16% got a C. But I don't want to have to mouse over it. I want to be able to look at it and see all the data values. So let me go to Chart Layout, which for me is right next to Chart. If you're using a PC or if you're using a different version of Excel, you might have to do a little hunting before you find these functions or these tools. But for me, I can just go to Chart Layout, Data Labels, and I want percentages. And now it gives me all of the percentages easily visible. The other thing is charts should always have a title. So I'm back in Chart Layout, go to Chart Title, Title above Chart. And I'm going to call it, parts of the class score in each grade category. And let me just specify that this is period 2. Okay, so parts of the period 2 class scores in each grade category. I am putting a fairly specific chart title because if you're not specific enough, then there are certain rules for how you would write titles for some types of graphs, but when in doubt, just be specific. And I can resize this by just clicking and dragging in the corner. And I can reposition it, and I'm done with this one. Okay? Oopsie. Or question 1, and let's move on to question 2. So the question says, how did students do on quiz 1? What is the distribution of scores? So I'm going to Command C to copy that. And let me paste it into this cell here. And I actually went ahead and I set up what I need for this question. So I've got my quiz scores, I got my bins set up, and I'll tell you how I figured out how I want my bins to be set up in a little bit. But first, let's talk about the question itself and how it's different from the first question. So I want to know what the distribution of scores is. That means I don't want to know how many students got an A, a B, a C. I want to know that within this 40% of the class that earned A's, well, how many of them got a 20 out of 20? How many got a 19 out of 20? How many got an 18 out of 20? And if I did that way, then I'd end up with like a bunch of teeny tiny little pie slices that would be really confusing to look at and wouldn't give me a lot of visual information to help me analyze my scores. So instead of doing that, I'm going to do a distribution. And in order to do that, I have to first figure out how many bins that I want for my distribution. So let me start out by determining, well, what's the minimum value and what's the maximum value of my data. Now I can look at the minimum value just by kind of eyeballing it, and that's easy because I only have 25 data points here. But if I had like 500 data points, I don't want to search through all 500 data points for the minimum value. So instead, what I can do is I can just pick a cell and I can type in a function. So =, min, and inside the parentheses it wants the first number of the data set and then the next number all the way to the last number, which I could just simply do this. Click, drag, let go. It enters it for me into this function bar, which once again is also at the top. And then hit enter. And it tells me that the minimum value is 9.5, so let's just double check that. And there's a 9.5, and I don't see anything lower than that. Okay, next, maximum value equals max. And inside my parentheses, I want to put in my data. And hit enter. And before you hit enter, just double check that there's an open parenthesis and a closed parenthesis. And there is. And it tells me that there's nothing higher than a 20, which is definitely true. Okay, so since I know that my minimum value is 9.5, even though quiz scores can go from 0 to 20, there's going to be no one in between 0 and 9. So I might as well just set my first bin for 9. And then my max score is 20, so there's no point in going up to like 21 or 22. I may or may not have offered extra credit for this quiz. I don't remember. I probably didn't. But yeah, I'm just going to cover my bases and just stick 20 to 20.9 as my last bin. So that means that if I decide to do intervals of 1 point, and I could pick whatever intervals I want. I could do intervals of 2 points or 5 points or whatever, but I'd like intervals of 1 point. So if I do intervals of 1 point between 9 and 20.9, that's 12 bins. For my labels, once again, you want to choose the upper limit for each bin. So for this one, I'm going to label it 9.9. And then for the next one, I could type in 10.9, then 11.9, then 12.9, but that's kind of a pain. So instead of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in a function, so equals, and I want to do 9.9 plus 1, because it's intervals of 1. So I can just click on this, and it will auto-enter E60 for me, plus 1, enter, and it gives me 10.9. Now I can take this, and do you see that little blue square in the bottom right corner of the cell? You want to mouse over it, click on it, drag it down, and by dragging it down, you're telling Excel to autofill that same function for all of those other cells. And it does. So we're good to go. Okay, now for the frequencies, just like before, you want to just select all of the cells that are going to be part of your array. You want to start writing in your function, so frequency, and then you need to put in both the data array and the bins array, and you need to separate them with a comma. So I'm going to start with my data array. I want all of my quiz scores in there. We're going to calculate the frequency of each score in this data set. And then I'm going to put in a comma. Okay, so I've got my data array, I've got my comma. And then now I need my bins array, so I'm going to get these bin labels. Once again, remember, these are the upper limits only for each bin label. And instead of hitting enter, because if I do that, it's only going to apply the function to the first cell, and I want it applied to all cells. So I'm going to hit Control, Shift, Return. And now it's telling me that I have one score that's between 9 and 9.9. So let's just double check that. Okay, there it is, and I don't see any others. It's telling me I have 0 scores that are in the tens, and it looks like that is true. And it's telling me I have 2 scores in the 20s, so let's find them. There's one, there's another, and I don't see any others. So this data looks pretty legit. Okay, let's go ahead and produce our distribution chart. I'm going to select all of these, the frequency values, and let's go to charts, and I'm going to do column, clustered column, and there we go. I want you to notice, by the way, that this is going to go from low to high scores. So over here, this is my 1F. And then over here, these are my 2 A pluses. And this is why you want to set up your bins from lowest value to highest value for this type of chart. Because if you did it the other way around and the A's are on the left and the F's are on the right, it would look really, really off. And it would probably be interpreted by people who look at your chart in the wrong way. That's not true of pie charts. With pie charts, you could do your bins in whatever order you want, and it ultimately doesn't really matter. but for distribution charts, or what we call histograms, you should do it from highest to low. I'm sorry, lowest to highest. Okay, so this is actually a bar graph, not a histogram, and that's not what we want. So the first thing that we want to do here is let's turn this into a histogram instead of a bar graph. And I can do that by, I think, format data series. So I basically just pick any bar, and then I right click, and then format data series. And this gap width should be a 0 because in histograms there are no gaps between the bars. Okay, and now it's a histogram. Let's do some formatting. So first of all, I don't need a legend because there's only one type of thing in here, and that would be quiz scores. So let's get rid of that. Let me expand this out so that I have more space to work. And I need some axis labels, so I'm going to go to chart layout. I'm going to go to axis titles, and once again I'm using Excel for Mac 2011. If you're using a different version of Excel, you might find these buttons in different places. If you're using Excel on a PC, then you might find them laid out differently as well, and some of the commands might be different. So if that's the case, look at the Gelayer Academy videos. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and title on the horizontal axis. I'm going to call this quiz scores. And then on the vertical axis, I want a rotated title because that way it's easier to write what I want. And so now it turns the title sideways. And I'm going to write in that these are the number of students with each score. With each score. And then let me give the entire chart a title. And I'm going to call this, period 2 distribution of scores for quiz number 1. You want a pretty descriptive title when you do these charts, so giving just enough information will help other people to analyze your chart. And that will also earn you points on a free response question on the AP exam. Now the other thing is, you'll notice that these quiz scores go from 1 to 12. Okay, that's clearly wrong because I set up my bins so that they would go from 9 to 20.9. And so this is not what we want. So I'm going to click on the horizontal axis, and I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to go to select data. And here what I'm going to do is click on category x-axis labels right here. And I'm going to click on this little icon next to it so that I can just select it directly from my Excel chart. And I want these guys. Okay, so when I click and I drag, what it does is it automatically fills in what's supposed to go into the data source, and let me hit enter. And OK. And now it relabels them with my bin labels. So pretty good, right? Actually, you know what it would have been even better? I can, by the way, there are two ways that I can access the select data window. I could go there, or for me, I could go to chart layout. I could go to axes, and then, or do I go to axes? Oh yeah, I go to axes, and then I go to axis options, and I think it does it for me here as well, under number. Never mind, forget I said anything, cancel. Yeah, quickest way to get there is select data. Okay, so instead of that, let me change that out. Let's do this instead. The bins themselves would be more descriptive. So select these, enter. Okay, and then now it puts them in for me. And then what I could also do is I could change the like the rotation on the axis so that it fits them a little bit better. So like let's say that I wanted to do a 45-degree angle for my data points. Okay, I could type in 45 and then OK. And now what it does is it sticks them at a 45-degree angle so that I can better fit my axis labels in here. Okay, so now I've basically produced a distribution that tells me that most of my scores are clustered right around here, with the major score distribution being at in the 19s, and then the next major score distributions being in the 17s and the 15s. It also tells me that just the overall trend here, like if I drew a distribution curve over the top of these histogram bars, it would be a curve that would kind of lean to the right. Okay, so some observations that I can get from this. I mean, those were my observations. I can see that I've got most of my scores clustered in here, and that in general the graph seems to kind of lean to the right. So what are some inferences I can make based off of this? Inferences are not really statements of fact, because I don't know for a fact that, like, you know, the class studied really hard for this quiz, because I wasn't at their house when they were doing it. I don't know for a fact that a lot of students retook this quiz, because I don't remember that far back. And I don't know, you know, if maybe my quiz was too easy for the students, because I can't see inside of their heads. But all of those are inferences that I can make. Maybe they studied really hard. Maybe a lot of them chose to retake this quiz. Maybe they, you know, didn't have a lot of other tests for their other classes that week. Maybe the quiz was just too easy and I need to make it harder because this is an honors class. So those are all inferences that I can make based off of the observations that I've got here. Question 1 and question 2. Let's take a look at question 3. And the question says, John told me at the beginning of the semester that he doesn't do well on my quizzes. Matt and Sage never talk to me, but I know that they also tend to struggle on my quizzes. How did John, Matt, and Sage do on quiz 1? How did they do on quiz 2? And how did their scores compare to the rest of the class? So let me just go ahead and copy that question. And let's take a look at how they did. So I've got John down here. I can see he got a 15 on quiz 1 and a 3 on quiz 2. So the 3 is obviously really bad, but the 15, I don't know. Like, is that on average with the rest of the class? Is that good compared to the rest of the class? Is that worse than how most other students did? And I can kind of eyeball it just by looking at the distribution curve, but that's exactly what it would be. It would be just kind of an eyeball guesstimate. And it's not really a good way for me to determine using, you know, a visual representation of the spread of the data where he falls in here. So in order to get like a more visual summary of where this student falls in comparison to the rest of the class, I should do a box and whisker plot. Now at this point, you may not have learned about box and whisker plots in math, in Algebra 2, so if you didn't, then why don't you pause the video here, go watch the Khan Academy videos, which I posted in blue on the NBA file, and if you go to that video menu, then you're going to see that there's a whole series on box and whisker plots. So learn what the parameters are for setting up a box and whisker, and then come back to this video. Okay, you're back! So now that you know what I need for a box and whisker plot, let's get a move on. So I'm going to paste question 3 in here. And I'm starting to not like how I have to scroll up and down in this file because it's starting to get pretty long. So let me clean this up a little bit. I don't really need question 1 and 2 or their answers anymore, so I'm going to hide them. And the way that I do this is you'll notice that when I come over here if my mouse is in like these row labels, it turns into a black arrow. So once I've got this black arrow, I can just click and drag to select all of these rows that I want to hide. And then now I can right click on this area and I can hide these cells. And you can see that row 28 and row 86 are now labeled in blue, and there's a blue line in between them. When you see that on an Excel spreadsheet, that means that there's something hidden there. And so to unhide it and see what it is, you can just select those two rows, right click, and then unhide. But I'm gonna go ahead and keep it hidden. Okay, so I know that I'm looking for how these three students did on quiz 1 and quiz 2, which means that I need this information here. Including the names, because I'm looking for how certain specific students did against the rest of the class. So let me copy this and let me paste it in here. Just kind of like overshoot the number of cells that I need. And then right click paste. And next. Why did it do it twice? Maybe I overshot too much. Okay, so let's take one of these out. So take this and right click delete. Okay, so who are my three students that I'm looking at? It's this guy. So let's go ahead and I'm in the home toolbar and I'm going to hit fill to highlight his scores. This guy, fill, and this guy, fill. Okay, now that I've done that, I want to create space to work to set up my parameters for each quiz, so let me move quiz 2 over a little bit. So once I highlight it, if I mouse over the edge of that highlighted section, then my cursor turns into a hand. And once it's a hand, I can now drag that over. So I want to separate them by 3 columns, just because I feel like making it 3 columns. So here, let me get the my 5-number summary to set up my box and whisker plots. So that means I'm going to need the minimum score, I'm going to need the first quartile, I'm going to need the median score, I'm going to need the third quartile, I'm going to need the max score. And let me just select these, Command C, or if you're on a PC it's Control C, and then Command V to paste them for quiz 2. Alright, so for my minimum score equals min, and stick my data in there, it autofills it, and then enter. Okay, so my minimum score is a 9.5. For my first quartile equals quartile. And then there are 2 things that need to go in here. The data that I want Excel to find the first quartile for, comma, which quartile I want. It's the first one. So let's start with the data. Let's select that. Excel autofills it for me as I select them. And then comma, and it's the first quartile. So I'm going to enter a 1 and then hit enter, or on my Mac keyboard it's return. For the median, there's 2 ways I can do this. I can do equals median, and then I can select my data and hit enter, and it tells me that my median is a 17.5. So if I take all of the data points, all of my scores, and I organize them from lowest to highest, then the score right in the middle should be a 17.5. And then the score that's in between the minimum and the median should be a 15. Notice that that's not a numerical like middle, that's like in terms of the number of scores. So that should be like the 8th score out of a class of 25. Or the 7th score? Never mind, like the 6th score. I'm not good at math. This is why I'm not a math teacher. Okay, so the third quartile, I'm going to put equals quartile and select my data and comma 3, enter. And then for the max, there are 2 ways I can do this. I can do equals and then I can do quartile. Sorry, what I meant to say was I can do equals and I can do max. And then I can select my data and enter, and my max score is a 20. The other way that I can do this, same thing with my median actually. Looks like I never taught you the other way to calculate a median. So let me do that first. So the median is also known as the second quartile. So I can hit equals quartile, and then select my data, and then comma 2. And then same thing for my max. It's also known as the fourth quartile. So if I delete that, then I can also calculate the same thing by hitting equals quartile, select my data, and then comma 4, enter. Okay, so I've got my minimum score, my first quartile, my second quartile, my third quartile, and my fourth quartile scores. Now let me copy these. So Command C, or if you're on a PC, Control C. And then notice that in between here and here, I've got 3 columns. 1, 2, 3, right? So then same thing between here and where I want this to go. I've got 3 columns. 1, 2, 3. And so because the spacing is the same thing with my data arrays. 1, 2, 3. 3 columns in between them. So because the spacing is all the same, what that means is that if I just highlight these cells and I hit Command B, it's going to autofill those functions for me for quiz 2. So yeah, super easy. I only need to enter the functions in once. Okay, now the next thing that I want to do is I want to figure out what I should be looking for in my box and whisker plots. So I'm going to need the range. I'm going to need the interquartile range. And I don't like how this text is spilling over outside of the boundaries of the cell, so I'm going to hit wrap text. This is under home. And there it is. But that E got broken off, so let me just change the font size. And now it's all nice and neat. Now the next thing I need is the lower fence, and I need the upper fence of my data. And these fences are to basically help me identify any outliers. Any data points that fall outside of the lower and upper fences are outlier data points that skew the mean or the average. Okay, so the range is essentially the difference between the maximum score and the minimum score. So let me hit equals max. So I just click on the cell that I want and it autofills it for me, and then minus, I'm just basically hyphen, and then click on the min, enter. The interquartile range is the difference between the third and the first quartile, so I can hit equals, and then third quartile minus first quartile, enter. The lower fence, the way I calculate that is I take 1.5 times the interquartile range, so 4 times 1.5 is 6. I subtract that from the first quartile, and that gives me the lower fence. And then I add it to the third quartile, and that gives me the upper fence. So for the lower fence, I'm going to do equals first quartile minus interquartile range, but I have to multiply that by 1.5. So I'm going to put in an asterisk, because asterisk means multiply, 1.5, enter. And then for the upper fence, it's going to be equals, let's take the third quartile, plus the interquartile range, but that needs to be multiplied by 1.5. And of course you guys know that Excel follows the order of operations, so the multiply function takes precedence over the addition function when I enter it like this. But if you're really nervous about that, you could also stick in some parentheses around it to tell it to do the multiplication first. And that essentially means the same thing. Oops, what happened? Undo. Yeah. No, okay, that's right. Okay, so now I can take these functions, I can copy them, and I can paste them into here. And it does it for quiz 2 for me. Oh yeah, and then these labels, let's copy and paste them as well. Command V. Okay. Now this is where things get a little bit funky weird, because if you take a look at the charts that you can do in Excel, there is no box and whisker plot that you can select for. So this is where we're going to do a lot of work. So it's probably easier just to draw your box and whisker plots by hand when you do the NBA graphing assignment, instead of doing it in Excel, and then take a picture of it and upload that picture and insert it. Or if you're doing it from your smartphone, just go into your Google Drive app, hit the scan button on the bottom and take your picture, and it will upload it into Drive for you. Here's how I'm going to do it. And I learned all of this by watching a bunch of YouTube videos. I spent like an hour watching YouTube videos trying to figure out how to do a box and whisker plot in Excel. And what it essentially comes down to is some really creative formatting. So I'm going to type in quiz 1 differences in here, and let's wrap that text. And I'm going to type in quiz 2 differences in here and wrap that text. And why are we doing that? Because, you know, YouTube told me to. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to basically put in my minimum value here. And at this point, if you start, like, you know, you accidentally click away, and now Excel starts putting in all these other stuff into your formula box, and you're like, ah, what's going on? I've made that mistake multiple times, so let me tell you how to clean it up. You can go into the function bar at the top, you can clean it up, and then you can hit the check mark, and it will apply that, and now you're out of that function bar. Or you could hit the X to just cancel out. That would be these two things right here. Okay, now the other thing here is the first quartile. I want the difference between the first quartile score for quiz 1 and the minimum score. Enter. For the median, I'm going to want the difference between for the next difference. I shouldn't be calling it first quartile. I should be calling it the next difference. So for the next difference, I want the difference between the median score and the first quartile score. For the next difference, I want the difference between the third quartile score and the median score. And then last of all, I want the difference between the max value and the third quartile score. And then I can't copy and paste these into here because they're not separated by those 3 columns, so it's not going to work. So instead I need to do this by hand. So for this one, I'm going to just make it equal to our minimum value for quiz 2. And then for the next, oopsie, see, I did it again. Let's clean that up. Check. Okay. Then for this next one, I want the difference between the first quartile score and the minimum. Enter. And then this should be the difference between the median score and the first quartile score. Enter. And then this should be the difference between the third quartile score and the median score. Enter. And then now this is the difference between the max score and the third quartile score. Enter. And these difference values are what we're going to use to create our box and whisker plot. So highlight those 2 sets. We're going to go to charts. We're going to go to column, and we're going to pick stacked column. I don't know what the difference is between stacked column and 100% stacked column, so to be safe, I'm just going to choose stacked column. And now, here's the crazy formatting. We're going to switch the plotting. So up here I'm in charts and just switch plot. If you're on a PC, then it might be located somewhere else, so watch the July, or not the July Academy video, but whatever video I posted in the NBA file to help you with this. Okay, so this blue bar here, if I click on one of them, it selects both. And this is essentially the space between 0 and the minimum score, which is nothing to me. So I'm going to just remove it. Right-click, Format Data Series. And let's go to Fill. And I'm going to do No Fill. And if you're on a PC, you might be able to get here through some other mechanism. But for a Mac, I think that's how you do that. Okay. This bar here, So that's actually not supposed to be part of the box and whisker plot. The box and whisker plot should only include the first quartile, which is right there, the third quartile, which is right there, and everything in between, including the median line, which is right there. So I need to remove this to make my box and whisker plot. Format data, so right-click Format Data Series, no fill. Okay. Same thing up here. Now you'll notice that there's no blue bar on quiz 2, and that's because the difference between the third quartile and the max is 0. So yeah, that's why there's nothing there. But anyways, right-click, Format Data Series, and I should be in fill, no fill, and that takes that out. Okay, now that means that this legend is useless, so let's remove that. Just select and delete. And I can resize it, kind of like stretch it out a little bit. And let's add in the whiskers. So the way you add in the lower whisker is we're going to use Excel's error bar tool. And I'm going to click on this area below the first quartile, and I'm going to right-click. And I can go to Format Data Series, and I can go to Error Bars on a Mac. The other way that I can do it in a Mac is I can go to Chart Layout in the top toolbar. I can go to Error Bars, I can go to Error Bar Options, and it takes me to the same place. So I want the lower error bar because I just want this one. So let me hit minus. And then I do want to make sure that there's a cap because in a box and whisker plot you always have that cap. And then I'm going to do a custom selection. We're going to specify the value that we want. And for our negative error value, click on this little icon that looks like Excel cells on the right. And I want essentially these differences between the first quartile and the minimum to be the length of my error bars. So I'm going to click that 5.5 right there. And then I'm going to command click the next one just so that I can select them both at the same time. And now it's put in J92 and K92, which is this and this. So hit enter. Okay. Wow, what's wrong? Let's try that again. Let's try that again. I want this and this. Okay, and that's good to go. Hit OK. And then for the plus error bars, or the top whiskers, I'm going to click on this area here. Right-click, Format Data Series. Now I'm going to hit the plus error bar. I want a cap on it. I want to pick my own custom values, so let's specify those values. And I'm going to choose right here, the difference between the max score and that third quartile. So click on this, and click on this, command click to select them both, or control click if you're on a PC, and enter. Okay, and okay. So now what this should do is my whisker should go down to the minimum score for quiz 1, and the minimum score is a 9.5, right? So it looks like it's going down to about a 9.5. And then the maximum score was a 20, and it looks like it's going up to a 20. For quiz 2, my minimum score was a 3, my max was a 20, and it looks like it's going from a 3, right, that's a 3, to a 20. So last of all, the box and whisker plots usually don't have multiple colors like this, so let's just change the fill. Format Data Series, and I'm going to just pick a fill, orange. And then I want to put black lines around it to distinguish that top box from the second box, because I am going to eventually put them in the same color. So stick a black line around it. Okay, and then same thing for here. Let's right-click, Format Data Series, change the fill to orange, because I like orange. And then let's go to line, and let's put a black line around it. And last of all, let's format our chart. So I'm going to go to chart layout, chart title, and let's put a title above the chart, and let's call this, spread of box and whisker. I'm sorry, spread of data around the median for quiz 1 and 2. This is period 2 spread of data, period 2. Okay, so I've got my title, and then I could, label my bottom axis probably, so axis title, horizontal axis, title below axis, and we'll just call these quiz number, and then that's quiz number 1 and quiz number 2, and then let me also put a vertical axis. I want a rotated title, and I'm going to type in quiz score. Okay, and my box and whisker plot is done. I don't even know if those titles were necessary. Now let's interpret the results. So John had a 15 on quiz 1, and you can see that a 15 is actually not near the median, because here's the median right here, right? So John is actually at the bottom of that third quartile, or that first quartile. So he's in the lower 25% of the class on that score. Matthew is even lower than him, and then Sage is even lower. Sage is pretty much near the bottom. Now let's take a look at our fences. The lower fence for quiz 1 was a 9, and the upper fence was a 25. That means that if anyone got lower than a 9, they're outliers. They're not part of this acceptable data spread. So did anyone get lower than a 9? And nobody did. So none of these 3 kids are outliers in my data spread. And then the upper fence was a 25, and nobody got a 25. Okay, so for the other one, Sage got a 15, Matthew got a 15, and John got a 3. So a 15 for quiz number 2 was also like that bottom of the first quartile right there. So that means that all 3 kids were in the bottom 25% of my class on their score for quiz 2. Now if we take a look at the lower and upper fence, the lower fence is 7.5, upper fence is 27.5. But for that lower fence, anyone who gets below a 7.5 is not within an acceptable data spread. So that means that Sage and Matthew are both, within that area. But John, he had a 3. He's outside of the fences. That's John right there. That means that John is an outlier, and because of his extremely low score, he actually skews the data. So if we calculate the average for quiz 2, I'll do that down here, equals, an average is also known as a mean. Never mind, I think in Excel you have to type in average. Average. Okay, so if we calculate the average for quiz 2, select my data, oops, delete. Let's try that again. So average, select my data, enter. The average is a 16.84, and the median was a 17, so they're actually still relatively close. But it's definitely true that in most instances that one outlier score would probably have pulled down my entire mean, or my entire average for the class. So yeah. Okay, I'm done with number 3. So we're done with number 3, and if you skipped that part with me doing the box and whisker plot in Excel, you might want to just backtrack a little bit to the very end, just because I was talking about how to interpret John, Sage, and Matt's quiz scores using the box and whisker plot. So if you want to know, what is the purpose of making a box and whisker, and why is it useful, just take a look at the last couple of minutes of the previous section for number 3. Let's do number 4. So the question is there a relationship between how well students do on quiz 1 and how well they do on quiz 2? So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, Command C, or if you're on a PC, Control C. And then let me stick that in here. So Command V. And now that I don't really need number 3 anymore, I'm done with it. I want to hide it just to get it out of the way. So let me highlight that and then right click and hide it so it cleans up the sheet. So now you can see that we've got blue lines in between number 28 and 86, as well as between number 86 and 119. So we have 2 sets of hidden data here. So if I want to unhide number 1 and 2, questions 1 and 2, I would highlight 2886. I would right click and I would unhide. If I want to unhide question those and unhide them. But right now I don't need any of that stuff. So I want to know if, like, let's say I've got, for example, Shannon. So she got a 19.5 out of 20 on quiz 1. Does that mean that I can reliably expect her to do well on future quizzes as well? Like, if she does well on quiz 1, is that a reliable predictor that she's going to do well on quiz 2 and on quiz 3 and so on and so forth? If someone like Maya gets a 9.5 out of 20 on quiz 1, then is that a reliable predictor that she's going to also do poorly on quiz 2 and quiz 3 and so on and so forth? But just to keep things simple, we're only going to use 2 variables. So we're going to use scores for quiz 1 and scores for quiz 2. Let me go ahead and copy these 2 columns. And I don't need names this time. I'm not being asked about any students in particular. So right click, copy, or you could do Command C. And then I'm just going to ignore that first column since it has a different width. And let me paste that in. Okay. So if I want to know if there's a relationship between these 2 variables, what I should do is I should plot each of these as if they were actual, variables x and y. So if this was an x column and if this was a y column, then in math, what kind of graph would you do? Hopefully you are immediately thinking that you would plot each data point and then you would try to find a best fit line. So we call that a scatter plot. So I'm going to go ahead and select that data. And I want to just kind of ignore the titles of those columns because that's not relevant for this. And then hit Chart and Scatter. And I'm just going to choose a marked scatter. I don't want any of these other ones with the lines already in them. So marked scatter. Okay, and let's go ahead and format our chart. First of all, let me just kind of, I'm trying to resize it, but it keeps trying to move it instead. All right, there we go. Okay, so first of all, no need for a legend on this one, so get rid of that. And let's identify our x-axis and our y-axis. Let's label them. So I'm going to go to Chart Layout and Axis Titles and Horizontal Axis Title. That would be that first column. So that's Quiz 1 scores. Quiz 1 scores. And let's label the vertical axis, so back to Axis Titles, and I want a rotated title so that it's easier to type in my label. And the y-axis is basically that second column of data. So I'm going to type in Quiz 2 scores. Okay, and let's give this chart a title. And anytime you do any sort of scatter plot or line graph, you're going to want to, in general, title it in this format: x-axis versus y-axis, or independent variable versus dependent variable. So I'm going to title it Quiz 1 scores versus Quiz 2 scores. The other way that I could title it, and I think this is perfectly legit, but if I wanted to title it a different way, I could title it as, you know, correlation between, let's capitalize that, between Quiz 1 scores and Quiz 2 scores. And articles like "and" don't need to be capitalized. That's an English language convention. Okay, so I've got all my data points plotted, and looking at them, the question is, are those dots just kind of randomly there, or is there some sort of a pattern? And I can try to eyeball it. Like, it looks like I've got a cluster of dots right here, but to be honest with you, it's a little hard to tell if there's an actual pattern or if they're just kind of like randomly scattered everywhere. So the best thing to do here would be to figure out a best fit line and to get a correlation constant. So I'm going to add a trend line. So once again, I right-clicked so that I could add a trend line, which means a best fit line. And I'm going to go to Options, and it's already added the trend line. If you notice, like as soon as I clicked Add Trend Line, it added the trend line. But I want to know a couple of things. First of all, what's the equation of the trend line? So there's y equals, what is it, mx plus b? That's the general formula, right? So there's my slope, and there's my intercept. If I extended the line all the way back until it intercepted the y-axis, that would be my intercept. In science, I know in math you do that, the linear regression. In science, we don't do that unless the experimental circumstances warrant it. So you want to be careful about just like automatically extending a line back to the origin or extending a line back to the y-axis. You only do it when circumstances, you know, make it obvious that that is a natural step to do. And we'll talk about that here and there as we do some of the labs over the course of the semester or the year. The other thing I want is what we call the Pearson correlation coefficient, which is basically the R-squared value. You don't need to know what R-squared means or how we calculate it or what, you know, the Pearson correlation coefficient is. What you do need to know in general is what this value tells you about whether the relationship between these two variables is strong or weak. So if you have a line that's kind of like sloping upwards, your R-squared value should be, well, R-squared values are always positive because squared values are always positive. But in general, if it's sloping upwards, then you're going to get a positive R value and a positive R-squared value. If the line is sloping downwards, then you get a negative R value. So if you have a positive value, then that means that the value has to be somewhere between 0 and 1. A 0 means that there is basically no relationship at all between the two variables. A 1 means that there is 100%, like a perfectly strong relationship between the two variables to the point where we would probably expect it to be a cause and effect relationship. And then you can see that my R-squared value here, let's just click OK. My R-squared value here is a 0.2. So is it closer to 0 or is it closer to 1? In other words, is it closer to like no relationship or is it closer to a perfect relationship? So there is a relationship, because if there wasn't a relationship, this R-squared value would be practically 0. But it looks like it's a relatively weak relationship. And in fact, if you take a look at what, you know, just we can pick random students. If you take a look at what people got, that's going to be true. Like Casey, she got a 20 and then a 20 and then a 19 and then a 20 and then an 18 and then a 21. So clearly all semester long, she's been doing awesome. And then you look at someone like Maya. who got a 9.5 on the first quiz, and then an 18 and a 19 on the next two. So Maya is, she's been up and she's been down. And it's the same with John. Like here he got a 15, then he got a 3, then he got a few more 15s, then a 9, and then he got a series of A's all in a row. So this tells me that, you know, if they do poorly on the first quiz, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do poorly on the second quiz. So that's my observation. It's a weak relationship. Let's talk about inferences. I can infer that maybe someone like John, who got a 3 on this quiz number 2, what was quiz number 2 about? It was about DNA structure and replication. Okay, so I don't know, maybe he was absent the day that I gave lecture. Maybe he had a football game that was super important because he is a football player. Maybe he was sick that week. Maybe he like misnumbered his answers, and you know how when you skip a space and you forget that you skipped a space and you transpose all of the other ones. So maybe he did that. It could be all sorts of reasons. I could make so many different inferences. Maybe his quiz was just graded wrong. I don't know what it was, and I can't ask him. I could, but I didn't. So, you know, this tells me that the way that you do on one quiz is not necessarily a good predictor of how you're going to do on the next quiz. Okay, so we're done with number 4, and we're going to do number 5 next. Question. So, number 5 says, did John's quiz scores improve over the course of the semester in my class? And what about Matt's scores, and what about Sage's scores? So over time, from the beginning of the semester to the end, was there a trend upwards for these kids? So I'm going to copy that question. I'm going to stick it over here. And, oops, cancel. And let me hide my answer to number 4 because I don't need that anymore. So I'm going to highlight it, right-click, hide. Over the course of the semester, that means I need all of these quiz scores, and I need them for 3 students. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy all of these. And then right-click, copy. And let's paste them down here. Paste. Okay, so I only need 3 students, which means that I can just go ahead and delete all the rest. So let's highlight them, right-click, delete. And over here, I'm going to right-click and delete. And over here, right-click and delete. So now I have my 3 students. I could have done this with all of them, but then I'd have 25 lines running all over my graph, and that's not cool. So let's go ahead and select the data, and this time I definitely do want their names. Let's just select those cells. And go to charts, and hopefully you recognize that we're doing a line graph. So just line, and there they are. Let's format our graph. What I like is that they're already color-coded and a legend is already made for me. I'm going to need to go to chart layout, axis title, horizontal axis title, below the axis. This is going to be quiz number, and quiz number basically means you know, the progression of time. So quiz number 1 was at the beginning of the semester, quiz number 10 was at the end of the semester. On the y-axis, I'm going to select a rotated title, and we're going to title this quiz score. And I need a title for the overall chart, and I'm going to say that this is quiz number, capitalize that, quiz number versus quiz score. So that would be one way to title it, number versus score, independent variable versus dependent variable. Another way that I could title this is I could write, trend in quiz scores over time. And hopefully you recognize how this title and the previous one is basically saying the same thing. So let's start with John. How did you do? Well, so he started up and then down and then up and then down and then up and then down. And then what about Matt? Up, down, up, down, up, down. And what about Sage? Up, down, up, down, up, down. So is there any sort of trend over time? Doesn't look like it. Two of the three of them are up here. All three of them are up here. So those are some observations. That lets me infer that maybe I either taught this content really well. That's quiz number 3, DNA and RNA. So maybe I just taught them about DNA and RNA really, really well and everyone got it. Or maybe my quiz was too easy. Maybe they had no other assignments, major assignments for other classes due, so they could focus all of their study time on my class. I don't know, but they all did relatively well here. John did amazing here and here, especially compared to the other two. So that I could infer that maybe he just studied really, really hard about chromosomes and test crosses. I don't know. Maybe he got a tutor. So lots of things that I could try to infer, but in order to turn any of those into substantiating evidence for any hypothesis that I'd have to collect observations, gather data, and then analyze that data further. Okay, so what I realized just now is out of all of these, none of them really warranted a bar graph. So I want you to think about what is a question that I could have asked about my class that would have warranted making a bar graph, because we got a pie chart down, we got a histogram, we did a box and whisker plot, we did a line graph, we did a scatter plot. What question would have made a bar graph most appropriate? And if you can think of some good questions where a bar graph would have been much more appropriate than any of these other graph types, then that means that you've mastered this idea that there are different types of graphs that are useful for different functions when it comes to analyzing data. And I can also tell you for a fact that when you do the NBA graphing assignment, one of the questions is essentially asking you for a bar graph. So hopefully you can identify which one it is. Okay, so good luck with the graphing assignment. If you have questions, email me, and I'll be checking my email fairly regularly. And yeah, get to it.